Oh, hey there. Welcome to the Nerdy About Nature Podchat series, where I sit down with folks from different backgrounds and experiences to chat all about things pertaining to nature. My name is Ross, and this podcast is an extension of a passion project I started called Nerdy About Nature, which also includes tons of fun educational videos all over Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and basically everywhere else on the internet. Now, all that I create here serves as a means to inspire, educate, and engage folks with the outdoor world so that we can all become better stewards of it, have a little bit more fun when we're out enjoying it, and work to create a more inclusive, diverse, equitable, and just future for each and every one of us in this world that we all share. Because nature, it sure is pretty neat, and I think we should keep it that way. So come on, let's go get nerdy.
Come and take a nature walk with me. We're gonna check out some really cool trees. We're gonna hang around and talk about all those things in nature that we can't live without. Let's go get nerdy, yeah, let's get nerdy about nature. Nerdy, yeah, let's get nerdy about nature, baby. Nerdy, yeah, let's get nerdy about nature. Come on, let's get nerdy about nature.
What's up, nerds? Today on the Podchat, we're talking all about solutions to our logging and forest management issues all across North America, and we're doing it with a bit of a legend by the name of Barry Gates. So Barry is the forest manager at a little slice of heaven on earth called Wildwood, which is a demonstration ecoforest on Vancouver Island that I've talked about quite a bit lately, and for good reason. Wildwood is an incredible little real-life example of how we can manage our forest ecosystems in a way that incorporates multiple different shareholder values into the management plan. So instead of managing purely for economic gains, these forests are managed to include ecological, biological, social, cultural, spiritual, and community values as well. It's a pretty amazing and inspiring place that shows what's possible all across the whole of Turtle Island if we just stop and think about what we're doing just a little bit more. So what is Wildwood and how did it begin? What the heck is this whole thing called Ecoforestry and how does it differ in practice from our current commercial logging operations? What are some of the issues with commercial logging and how does Ecoforestry address it? Well, let's dive into all of that and more with Barry Gates here and get inspired to create some change. Thanks for popping on the podcast. It's been a nightmare trying to link up with you. You've been trying to do this for months now.
Yeah, we have, and I've been busy, and you've been busy. But welcome to Wildwood.
Yeah,
I know you've been here before, and you've done podcasts before, but it's always a great thing to come back here. And I think I want to open by just giving our land acknowledgement, acknowledging that we are on unceded territory of Coast Salish, and we have been working with Stanemus and Nanaimo on some of those issues, but yeah, we recognize that they were here long before us and have a rich history here at Wildwood. And we've talked to some of the people that have had family members that have used Wildwood in the past long before settlement arrived. So we acknowledge that and we appreciate that, and we do have language speakers, knowledge keepers, elders that do have free access to Wildwood.
Mm-hmm. So I guess on that note, do you want to also start by just introducing yourself, your title here, and what you do?
Yeah, I'm Barry Gates, and what I do is I manage private forest land, but I use an ecological model to do that. So I'm a woodlot manager, but I have been inspired and got my start actually at Wildwood in 1996. I came up to see what Ecoforestry is all about. The only Ecoforestry operation at that time was Merv's operation here, so I came up and chatted to Merv. But more importantly, I had to look around at Merv's forest because I have to see it on the ground to believe it's happening. And when I saw this forest here, and you're looking at it right now, I thought this is what forestry needs to be. And this is a model that I need to be using in forest management. And I took Merv's model and augmented that with more formal ecoforestry training to do the woodlot management that I do. But I have been a part of the Ecoforestry Institute, who is a trustee for Wildwood since 2002, so 20 years, and have seen it through a number of transitions. And I'm very proud to say that Wildwood is now an independent trust. The beneficiaries are the people of British Columbia, and it will always remain as a public asset, a place where we can teach ecoforestry, where people can come and see What exactly it is that Merv left behind, what Merv's legacy was, and how the practice of ecoforestry is a little bit different in what we're doing today.
Lot to break down there.
Yeah, there you go.
I didn't know, where did you get the ecoforestry training?
Well, it was hard to come by, first and foremost, having a look at what Merv was doing. Now, Merv was a great intuitive forester. He based his forest practice on his relationship with the land and with the ecosystem here. But there wasn't a lot of formal teaching at that time, so I grabbed it wherever I could. Now, there was some coursework over at, believe it or not, over at Malaspina College. What was Malaspina at that time is VIU now. So I took the coursework there. I did some government coursework that was available at the time. I looked at who was practicing ecoforestry, and Kindwoods down in the Highlands in Victoria. Orville Camp down in Oregon State, Washington was also practicing it.
I was going to say, yeah, I knew there was stuff down in Oregon.
Yeah, down
Isn't
in
it like
Oregon.
Alan Drexel, was that the name?
Yeah, Alan Drexel was actually part of the original, was a founding member of the Ecoforestry Institute Canada. And at that time, there was an Ecoforestry Institute USA and Ecoforestry Institute Canada. So they were offering training courses. So I took as much as I could, and then had an opportunity to actually put that to work on 400 hectare private forest down in Shawnigan Lake. And part of my process was learning by experience. And believe me, that's that is an interesting experience, because when you're taking stuff from the book or from somebody else's forest and trying to apply it to a different forest, you have to be very, very cautious with that. I learned a lot just by taking a slow and steady approach, looking at principles and trying to apply principles in an operational manner was a tough go. But at the end of the day, I think I've got it not too badly.
Well, and especially because it's such a unique formula that like it highly depends on each specific kind of biogeoclimatic zone and forest type within like the varied terrain around here. Like you really have to know the forest that you're working in. It's not just like a model that you can apply widely across the continent.
Yeah, good point, Ross. I mean, what you can apply are the principles of the model. And then when you're taking the principles and applying them to different biogeoclimatic zones, then your operational plans change dramatically, because you're looking at different natural disturbance types. And that really dictates a lot of your management planning.
Well, I mean, and even in this little plot of forest here, like since we walked down, like you were pointing out, there's just so many differences in variations, like high and dry up on the ridge. We have like this little low wetland here. Like everything is so varied.
Yeah, I mean, you're in the coastal Douglas fir zone, but within that zone, you have dry, nutrient-poor areas like we have up top, and then you have these extremely rich, productive sites down below. And here we have a really good example of what the people in BC are talking about right now, and that conserving and restoring rich, productive sites with big trees. And that's what we have here in this particular area. So pretty important to keep that intact.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a lot to go through, what ecoforestry is, Wildwood, the history of all that. Your background I would love to get into probably first. But before we do any of that, do you want to just quickly describe what we're looking at around here? Where are we right now? Like, what is this kind of ecosystem and what makes it so unique?
Yeah, well, coastal Douglas fir, of course, and dominant species, of course, is Doug fir, but supporting cast is grand fir, a little bit of hemlock, a few hemlocks, mainly cedar, grand fir, maple, arbutus, dogwood. So you have probably about 9 or 10 different species that also exist within this coastal Douglas fir zone. And they're really important, because if something happens in one of your species like Doug fir or a secondary species like cedar, you have some backup. One of those other species is going to actually take over and grow through that. So coastal Douglas fir, what we do have are, as I mentioned before, these big Doug firs, and some of these are over 500 years, and we don't know exactly how old, but we do know they're old. One of the trees I recently looked at up in Strathcona Park was actually about this size, but was over 2,100 years old, which is extraordinary. So
Douglas fir.
Yeah, Doug fir.
That's almost record-breaking.
Record-breaking, but somebody had taken the time. It had come down, and they'd bucked it up, and they'd taken the time to count the rings. And I was astounded. So I'm curious about how big these are. But anyway,
And how come you don't know the ages? You guys haven't bored into these?
We haven't bored into these. We can only do estimates on them.
Is there a reason why you haven't bored into them?
Yeah, I mean, whenever you're boring it, first of all, we don't have a borer long enough to go through them. If you look at the size of the
Fair
tree,
enough.
you need a really big tree bore. Secondly, when you bore into a tree, there's always a risk of bugs and fungi getting in. So we want to be respectful, I guess, of these trees. We don't need to know their exact age. We just need to know that they're over 250 years, which puts them into old growth category. But this is probably an ancient forest as well, which means it's gone through several repetitions of the sort of 1200-year cycle that you would find in this kind of a forest.
It's such a shame, I find, when we as humans try to put just like these arbitrary markers on it, like, oh, it's this old of a tree, therefore it's valued at this much, instead of looking at the physical attributes, like the complexity of like this Doug fir here, regardless of its age, up in that crown. It makes it so unique that, like, it's definitely not a 70-year tree farm plantation tree, It's
Yeah, I really like that idea. When you come into a forest, you really have to take away all of those labels and all of that information that you have about a forest and a tree and just experience the forest, experience the stand, experience the individual trees, and get an emotional hit from that. And then you can actually add some labeling to it. You can actually then break it down a little bit and say, well, according to our Western culture, that one's probably 500 years old. Coastal Douglas fir in really good shape, broken top, wildlife habitats, pileated woodpeckers all up and down. But you can break it down. But your first hit on a forest like this, as you look around, is, wow, this is just astounding. This is magnificent. I'm overwhelmed by it. So that if you're approaching that forest and you have that feeling, you're more likely to say, well, something, what's my relationship to this forest? And then how do I protect this forest and be sure that this is around for kids and grandkids and other generations to have a look at,
Yeah.
Simple as that.
That it's so funny to hear you say that, because I don't think there are many commercial foresters out there that even take into account an emotional hit when they enter a forest.
Yeah,
the economic system makes you value things or look at things differently. Like to take in emotional complexities is just not really a thing that's valued.
Well, a good point. I mean, and to get that emotional hit, you actually have to walk into a natural forest. And whether it's an old growth forest like this one, an ancient forest like this one, or whether it's a natural regenerating second or third growth forest, you get the same hit from it. Where you don't get a hit is from an industrial forest. One that's been planted and is on a short rotation monospecies. You just don't get a hit from that. As a matter of fact, if you're used to these forests here, those ones look really weird.
Yeah.
Almost Jurassic. Like you get a different kind of a hit. It's like, oh my God, what am I looking at here?
Yeah. So fake.
It has a funny feel to it. Anyway.
Yeah. Okay. So whereabouts are you from, and how did you get into forests?
Yeah, well, originally from Alberta. That's where I actually grew up in the north of Alberta, upper in Peace River Country, Jasper, Alberta. I spent some time in Penticton. I spent time in Alberta in a prairie town. I did my education in Edmonton. I moved to the coast in 1976. And I've been here ever since. Now,
Vancouver Island.
Yeah, Vancouver Island. Yeah, where else would you be?
Yeah.
And anyway, my early history, my career is divided in two parts. My first 25 years I spent as a family counselor. That was my educational background at that time, and I spent 20 years in the counseling field. And then I made a huge transition over into forestry. I decided to get away from people and look more at natural environments. And that led me into forestry, but it gave me an opportunity to have a peek at what was happening in forestry here in BC. So forestry is a big area. So when I was narrowing it down, I thought the only thing that makes sense to me is ecological management of forest lands, ecoforestry. And that's where I began to get involved in that. Probably around 1999, and I've been there ever since, learning about ecoforestry, practicing ecoforestry. I do management plans. I not only do management plans, but when I'm out on the woodlot, I'm the person that selects the trees for harvest. I'm the person that falls those trees, bucks and limbs them, and I'm the guy that runs the sawmill. So when I was doing my training, I thought I'm not just going to be a forest manager, a paper forest manager, but I actually be out in the woods and doing the work so that I understand every aspect of what we do in a forest, from management planning, ecological, through tree selection, through harvesting, through sawmilling, through marketing. So I have that sort of picture top to bottom.
And you kind of first were exposed to ecoforestry through coming here, meeting Merv.
Yeah.
Do you want to give me a little background on Wildwood and how it began? Who's Merv?
Oh, Merv. Merv is our inspiration. Merv is a character. Merv is this guy. Today you'd call him radicalized, but anyway,
Merv Wilkinson.
Merv Wilkinson. Merv goes way, way back. Merv actually grew up on the property next to Wildwood. That's where his family was, but he actually played in this forest when he was a kid, when he was a child. And I think that's when we talk about bonding with a forest environment, that's what he bonded with. But what he bonded with trees, wildlife, and just this sense that this was a pretty special place, so that when Merv bought this place, along with his first wife, Catherine, in 1938, he said, what do I do with it? And his first take on that was to turn it into kind of a homestead agricultural operation. So we went over to UBC, studied agriculture. But luckily, his prof was from Sweden and said, Merv, you've got a forest there. It's a great forest. Why don't you look at forestry? And actually trained Merv with what was a Scandinavian model at that time, which was single tree selection.
Mm-hmm.
That was new here, and
like a closed canopy type harvest.
Closed canopy, select individual trees according to a certain protocol. Merv learned that, and he practiced that from 1938 until he transferred ownership in 2001. Now, for Merv, that was a learning experience. A great intuitive forester, because what he did was pay attention to what he saw happening in this forest. So he was tuned into the trees, tuned into wildlife, tuned into process, and developed the whole idea of ecosystem and how important the ecosystem, the community, if you will, is to forest management. You need to keep it intact. He understood that. You need to take a precautionary principle in terms of, if you're not sure about it, don't do it. He understood that. But Merv was also a logger. He loved to harvest trees, and he loved to log, and that's how he saw himself. And so when he did take down trees, first of all, it was respectfully done. Secondly, he brought down trees that were next in. He kind of had a protocol for approaching it. Next in line of mortality, he'd look at a tree, look at the canopies, see which ones were undergoing stress or disease, and probably say, well, that's a good candidate for me to take out. The wood is still good. I can still make some money on it, and I can harvest that without jeopardizing any of the trees around. As a matter of fact, I'm probably doing them a favor, because if I take that tree there, then I'm opening up the canopy a little bit, and these somewhat repressed trees will actually benefit from that. So that's kind of the way he approached it, a very cautious approach, learning as he went along, and also very open to hearing what other people had to say. I know when a bunch of German foresters came from Germany and had a look around, they said, Merv, you got a problem here. Your forest is too tidy. You're taking too much woody debris out of here. And he said, fine, what do I do? He said, leave more on the ground. It's going to look a little bit messy, but it's really important ecologically. So he took that, and that's what he did. So constant learner, constantly aware of what was happening in this forest, constantly aware of change. Lifelong learner. He gave us the fundamentals of early ecoforestry, and he was adamant that what was happening in forestry in BC at the time was not right. That liquidating old growth and allowing natural regen, second growth, or plantation forest was not the way to go, that the repercussions from that would be felt in the future, that nature would respond in a negative way to that. But he said, if you want to keep your forest intact, if you want to keep delivering what we now call ecological services, keep that ecosystem intact, pay attention to it. cut down on how much you take out of a forest, and work with nature.
Right. And so all of these kind of learning lessons were as the foundation of, in the West, this idea of ecoforestry from
Absolutely.
our Western kind of understanding of it.
Yeah, from our Western understanding, I mean, Merv was an early adapter of ecoforestry principles. And there was a group that developed around that as well that actually led to the protests you saw in Clackwood Sound in the 90s, early 90s. Merv was part of that process and arrested for it. But when
Merv was arrested.
oh yeah,
And so
Merv,
he would have been in his like 80s.
oh yeah, he was out there on the front line with that, and
What a legend.
appeared in court, and as a matter of fact, was so passionate in his court speech delivery that the judge called him magnificently unrepentant. Which, although he's sentenced into some community work, I think that those sort of words describe how the judge felt about what he was forced to do with people like Merv at that particular point. And of course, Clackwood Sound led to Fairy Creek and all the rest of that. But Clackwood Sound was also an opportunity for people at that time to say, okay, we don't agree with what we see in forest management today, clear cutting, liquidation of old growth, but we need to be solution focused. What do we do instead? So because Merv had been doing that since 1938 on the woodlot here at Wildwood, it was a natural sort of place for people to come and actually see what good forest management looked like, and kind of a longitudinal study on conservation of old growth ecosystems. And Merv was again really clear that there was an abundance here, and that you could harvest this forest and still keep things intact. That was his message.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, it goes so against kind of the modern accepted commercial model, like, it's so monetarily driven by like making the highest economic returns you can in the shortest amount of time versus keeping the ecosystem intact. And old growth, regardless, it's about keeping ecosystems intact,
Oh, yeah.
And to our Western minds, this is like a new thing, quote unquote, for our understanding. But this is a process that like indigenous nations have been working with. And, like single tree harvest is not new. Like that's how these lands have always kind of been managed by the people who have stewarded these lands since time immemorial. So,
Yep.
in a way, it's kind of it's just like a new discovery of the same thing that's like always been true.
Yeah, and we're trying to get back to some of those indigenous teachings, and we're thinking about the one thing we've learned from Merv and from our indigenous neighbors is that you need to manage from the central theme of relationship with the land. You need to be able to form that relationship with the land. You need to respect the land. You need to adhere to the principle of reciprocity. And if you're doing that, you're probably in pretty good shape for land management. But if you don't start with a relationship and respect for the land, then you're going to do something very, very different, and probably something very destructive on the land. So the starting point, and we look at kind of a bicultural approach to land management here at Wildwood now, is having a look at what Merv did, what ecoforestry is, and what we learned from indigenous land management, and saying, well, how do these two come together, and do they have a similar starting point? And they do. And the starting point, of course, is ecosystem integrity, what we would call ecosystem integrity in our languaging, and what they would call relationship to the land in their languaging. And then we move from there. But if you have that underlying principle, then you have something you can develop a feedback loop to. Are we doing this? So we're learning a lot from indigenous forestry and land management, and they're learning something from us as well, because although Merv was a great intuitive forester, we're not great intuitive foresters. We have a relationship with the land, but we're more professional in our approach to our land management. In other words, if we want to carry on a dialogue with government, with industry, with other RPFs, we have to be talking their language. So when we do management planning for Wildwood, we have a look at what Merv did, but our management planning is based on, first of all, a principle of ecoforestry, but also standardized timber crews. We start with a timber cruise. We cruise the land. We do it according to Ministry of Forest standards. At the end of the timber cruise, we have a pretty good idea of what we have here in terms of species size, age distribution, polygons, that kind of stuff. And then we use the same kind of program they do for determining their annual allowable cut, except we're setting the parameters for ecological outcomes rather than fiber outcomes.
Because this is privately owned, you don't have to hit those annual allowable cut minimums.
No, we don't have any AAC requirements. As a matter of fact, our AAC for Wildwood looks like about a quarter of what you would find in an industrial forest, even though we're using the same methodology for assessing what we have in our timber crews, and we're using a similar kind of system for analyzing that data. At the end of the day, when we're setting our parameters for ecological outcomes, our AAC is much, much lower. There's still an AAC, but when we project our management planning over 250 years, which is what we do, what we want to see is we want to see that this conforms to what we'd find in a natural forest in terms of age class structure, in terms of species distribution, and a number of other parameters. And when we do that with RAC, we find that that it does really adhere to what you would find in a natural forest. And we also have about 85% of the biomass you'd find in a natural forest, and that's very, very different than what you would find in industrial forestry.
Yeah. So for those who may not understand
AAC,
annual allowable cut.
Allowable cut.
Yeah. What exactly is that, and why is that like an important factor when looking at commercial logging operations versus what you do here?
Yeah, commercial operations, 90% of commercial operations are clear cuts here in BC. So your annual allowable cut is based on a rotation. Let's say a rotation of 60 years, you're on a landmass of 10,000 hectares. Then you calculate how much you can take off per year in 60 years, so that when you, at the end of 60 years, you're ending up where you started with a forest, theoretically, that is now ready for harvest. That's 60 years, that's your rotation age. So it's in theoretical terms that is a good way of maintaining fiber production, and that's what they mean by sustainable forestry. When industry uses that term, they mean that they're going to have a sustainable fiber supply over time.
Not necessarily sustainable ecological function.
No, not one that's ecological function, but the main parameter there is fiber production. And in the beginning, that was probably something that worked when we had a lot of forest area here in BC, and we didn't have the technology to harvest at the rate we harvest today, but today it doesn't work for a number of reasons. Now, Ecoforestry actually takes a different sort of look at it. It says if the underlying goal here is to preserve this ecosystem intact, so it's producing ecological services, how do we do that? And what's our annual allowable cut? And on Wildwood, on our 100 acres here, our annual allowable cut is about 30 cubic meters, one logging truck load. If you were doing industrial forestry here, it would be about 129 cubic meters, which is the mean annual increment on this land. And so you can see that it's a much, much higher cut. But at the end of 250 years, with that kind of a cut, you'd eliminate almost all of the old growth, and you'd have a very, very different age class structure on the land. And I know that's a bit technical for people, but let me tell you that what you're seeing here around you would almost completely disappear. You'd have a much younger forest, and you would have much less species diversity.
I mean, and then there's all the ecological services, like it'd be tighter, be drier, it would be more prone to fire, it would be it's a funny thing to think about, just looking around at this forest, to think that someone at some point in time could have come in here and been like, oh yeah, it's okay to cut these trees down, and in 60 years we'll be able to replace them. I mean, with the fiber supply, I could see that reasoning, where it's like, you know, one of these trees, I don't know, equates to how many smaller 60-year-old trees?
Quite a few.
Yeah, so you could probably fit all those smaller trees in this tighter area, but like you're not going to have the spacing that allows for all the diversity and everything to function here.
No, you're not doing that. And getting back to the beginning of our conversation, when you walk into this forest, you have that kind of emotional, spiritual hit. And when you're walking into the managed forest that you're talking about, you never get that hit. So we're actually managing for different values, and we're managing for some pretty non-tangible values, where I'm managing for spiritual values. Want people to come here and feel inspired by this, want them to feel humbled by it. We're managing for ecological services, right from carbon storage. You're looking at a lot of carbon storage right here. Carbon sequestration. These big guys are still sequestering carbon. You're looking at oxygen production, which people forget about. Like one tree that size there is producing enough oxygen for 4 people.
Just this little Doug fir.
Yeah, the little Doug fir.
Yeah.
And people forget that we need that. You're looking at water regulation. These guys are super water regulators. That fir you're looking at, again, will probably suck up 95 gallons of water a day in the spring wet season.
That little fir there.
Yeah, that little fir, and it'll distribute about 30% of that into the atmosphere. So you can imagine when you have a whole stand or 1,000 hectares or 10,000 hectares of these trees distributing that amount of moisture, you actually get an atmospheric river running through that, and that's pretty important to have that. So ecological services are really good and really great. I mean, again, carbon storage units, but wildlife habitats. This is a very, very complex system here. And
that's one of the things that Wildwood kind of boasts about a lot, like the diversity.
Yeah, diversity of wildlife habitats, the diversity of wildlife, right from your big mountain.
We saw a little Pacific tree frog crossing the path on our way over here, just past the massive anthill.
Yeah.
That's thriving.
Yeah.
There's woodpecker and sapsucker holes all over these trees.
Yeah. And then we have a really healthy below ground community as well. Our fungi communities are up and running and working really well. And this is relatively new stuff for people. But what's happening underground is probably as important, if not more important, than what you see happening above ground here.
Right. And the amount of biodiversity in like a thimbleful of soil is incredible.
Yeah, your fungi are basically, you've got a number of different types of fungi in there, obviously, or most of them specific to certain species of trees, or specific to certain plant life in the
mycorrhizal fungi.
Yeah, different mycorrhizal fungi, different fungi feeders. And then you also have fungi attacking these trees as well as a natural disturbance type. So you've got a lot of fungal action here. As a matter of fact, fungi are kind of managing our forest here.
Yeah, I mean, just looking again at the diversity of topography, you can kind of see that at play. Like we're on this kind of higher, drier bluff with a lot of Doug fir, which are like an ectomycorrhizal connector, versus down in the valley, there's a lot of sword fern, maple, and western red cedar, which are arbuscularly mycorrhizal connected. So it's like just looking at this, you can see how that variation underneath the soil would change rapidly as you go from the top of that hill to this one we're on here and crossing the valleys.
Absolutely. You got to remember and always keep in mind that this is a community first and foremost. It's a complex community. And you need all parts of this community working together to make the community work. And that's what Ecoforestry is all about. Keeps it intact, keep the community functioning, and derive the benefits from that.
So there's not many ecoforest models kind of existing in the world these days. Or I guess in North America.
Not North America. I think where you're seeing them sort of make a resurgence are on indigenous conservation areas. Indigenous declared conservation areas, which are really big. You need the scale of size, and are being managed according to traditional knowledges, which is really important with them. So I think that's your biggest take on that. Some community forests, Proctor, for example, is what I would call an ecoforestry operation from what I know about it. And
I know the Cumberland one does a pretty good job.
Cumberland, not bad, but the ministry does not allow for ecoforestry on any of its cronland tenures.
Because the idea of ACCs is still enforced by the ministry in a way to keep mills and stuff operational. So even if you are theoretically have the license to manage a certain plot of land, the ministry is still telling you that regardless of your management values, you have to be producing this much wood every year.
Yeah.
So there's really no opportunity for this model to exist on public lands right now.
It's very, very hard to put this model on public lands because your AAC is calculated on the idea of that short rotation, that industrial cut, so that the AAC is calculated first and your management plan sort of develops around that. How are you going to make your AAC or meet your AAC requirements? Now, I guess that brings us to the sort of changes that are occurring in forest management, the government initiatives that we're seeing today. And I think it's fair to comment that the government, in response to the various reports that were done, are looking at a fairly fundamental change from fiber production, which is the AAC we're talking about, to
You're
ecological
referring
management.
to the Old Growth Strategic Review and the Last Stand report.
Yep.
Those things. Yeah.
Yeah, those reports that the government accepted and have endorsed as the future for forestry in BC, and are actually busy trying to actually implement, but that's a very, very complex process.
It's funny that you mentioned that because just I think 2 or 3 days ago, since we're recording this, what's today, September 13th, 14th, was the 3-year anniversary of the government acknowledging that they were going to accept and implement all 14 recommendations from the Old Growth Strategic Review, and to date, not a single one of those has been implemented.
Yeah, it's very interesting when you're doing that kind of analysis, and when you sort of dig below the surface a little bit on that, and have a look at the process they're engaged in. The first and foremost on the government's mind, I think, is just their commitment to Indigenous involvement in the process through DRPA and the legislation involved in that. So their first obligation is to consult with First Nations, which they have been doing. And then in the First Nations community, you have an interesting sort of dichotomy between people that are really supporting traditional knowledges and people that are saying basically we need an economic return on this. So there's a big discussion going on there around how you actually do that. The second part of that is being sure that you have the legislation that's necessary to change tenures, because you basically can't change a forest tenure with a major industrial forest company halfway through their tenure without incurring an economic repercussion from that, because that forest tenure is based on a certain AAC. So
in other words, you have to buy them out.
You have to either buy them out, transfer that tenure to First Nations, which has happened, or you need to wait until that tenure comes up for renewal and say, well, these are the new parameters that we're working on, which are ecological in nature. Are you interested in the forest tenure? If not, tenure can go to somebody else. So that's a little bit complex. Now, I was encouraged to hear that the government is thinking of actually appointing a chief ecologist for the province. Very interesting, because that would be a role, hopefully, that would work with the chief forester, or even supersede the chief forester, to actually bring about the legislative or the operational changes that are necessary to put this new system in place. So government has been tardy in getting this up and running, but I'm also pretty understanding of the complexity of involving major players like First Nations and major tenures throughout the province, because you're looking at if you introduce ecological management principles, you're looking at a big reduction in AAC, and that means that you're looking at an impact on communities that are forest dependent throughout BC. So you have to have an economic strategy for them to make that transition, which government has also been working on.
Yeah. I mean, there's just so many complexities
Yeah,
to it.
it's
Because even
not easy.
Well, even then, when you're looking at like thinking about the communities that would be affected by a lower wood production, for example, it's like the majority of the reason communities like that are in such a volatile state is because so many jobs have been lost to things like mechanization and like automation of like mills in particular, where it's like, you know, there's one person who runs a whole sector of like machines doing their thing that would have historically employed 50 people. And so there's like this whole trickle down thing where it's like the government is having to battle with all these very tricky, very detailed, very nuanced things. It's definitely a difficult situation to be in. And then you hear of There are instances like in the interior, I can't remember the name of the logging company, but the logging company was trying to manage their forests well, and the government was like, well, technically this is the regulation, you need to meet AAC requirements, so they weren't able to manage the old growth forest how they had wanted to. And then things like on Haida Gwaii, where the nation is like, there's no more logging here, and then all of a sudden Teal Jones is like, well, we're going to sue you for like, I think 75 million?
75 million. Yeah,
because now their tenure operations is being affected by the fact that the nation doesn't want any more logging on their land. So it's like there's a lot to it.
There's a lot to it, and it gets back to what I was saying about tenures. And if you do have tenure, you're a company that has tenure, then you are going to sue government for a breach of contract. But and
basically loss of profits in the future.
Yeah, lots of profit in the future, but it's a difficult process. But it's a process that can only be successful, I think, when the forest community is in crisis, because that's the only time that change can occur. So you do have a forest community in crisis. The growth yield models that they've used have been overestimated. You have bug and beetle outbreaks, you have fire, you have everything that contributes to a fiber supply, which is currently shutting down mills in the province. And that's a good time to make your changes, because the mills are already undergoing stress and shutting down because of compromised fiber supply. And if you want to make change, that's the time to do it, and basically say, okay, we're never going to harvest what we've harvested in the past in BC. But if we turn to an ecological model, then we're actually dealing with other issues like fires, like bugs, like a guaranteed fiber supply for communities at a lower level from ecologically managed forests. So there is an upside to that, but you have to go through a period of transition, which is often very, very difficult.
Right. And so there's wildfire, there's drought, there's bugs, disease. The first one you mentioned was just like a shortage, like basically improper yields, where things didn't grow back as fast as. Like I know a lot of our forests are understocked based on how much they should be.
Well, they had some pretty growth and yield models that they developed in the early days of forestry were pretty optimistic in what they were predicting, and those growth and yield models actually haven't worked well. And they forgot to tune them as they went along. They just made an assumption that the growth and yield models were actually going to produce what they said they'd produce, but they haven't. And they forgot to factor in things like fires and bugs. And so at the end of the day, you're seeing fiber shortages. But remember, in any community that's a forestry community, your harvesting starts in your biggest and best sites close to the community, and then it spirals outwards. And as you spiral outwards and up into more challenging terrain, the economics begin to not work. I mean, you can't bring small timber in long distances and expect it to actually produce an income for you. So at some point, you simply run out of fiber that's economically viable.
Well, and more extreme felling conditions and stuff, like when you're climbing mountains and everything.
Yep.
When you talk about like reduced yields and stuff too, I think that also comes from like a lack of understanding of like ecological processes at the time when those yields were set. Because it's like if you clear cut a forest and then heavy rains sweep all the nutrient-rich sediments away, like the next forest that follows isn't going to regenerate as fast as you had once thought, because all these systems like depend on one another in order to create like healthy, rich sites in the first place. Like this rich forest ecosystem in a way creates the soil that allows for a rich forest ecosystem to be here in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you put a climate change overlay on everything that's happening now,
right,
you realize that our climate systems are changing, so that you want fairly intact forests that are going to sort of manage and adapt to that if you can do it. And what you're talking about are forests that are poorly adapted to climate change. If you're clear cutting a forest, you're exposing that particular forest and the soil to deep erosion on some of those weather events that we have. And you're seeing that in communities like Grand Forks, or the flooding that we had a couple of years ago, which was very, very severe. But when they trace it back and have a look at it, they say, well, when you look at your upper forest lands, your forest lands surrounding these communities, you realize that they've been heavily harvested. And that's had an impact on on just water regulation and much more intense runoff, much more intense flood that occurred in those communities. So what you never realized when you introduced that model of sustained fiber supply was what I call ecological fall down. And, foresters will talk about fall down, and they'll talk about it in economic terms, in other words, the difference between the amount of money you made harvesting an old growth forest like you see around here as opposed to a second growth forest. An economic return on second growth is going to be much lower. They call that the economic fall down, but they never thought about the ecological fall down over time. In other words, what happens to ecological services when you have that kind of clear-cut sustained fiber yield model operating over decades of time? And the for structural changes that occur, the reduction in ecological services, much the same as we're talking about in terms of water regulation or insect control. Nobody's calculated that on a province-wide basis, and I think they need to do that when they're looking at a rationale for changing over to ecological management of forest lands.
Yeah, and again, there's so many nuance to just like the different types of lands too. Like when we were talking on the walk out, looking at coarse woody debris, and you guys realizing that you needed to leave more wood on the forest floor when historically wood on the forest floor is seen as wasteful, and it's like, well, pick it up, that's free wood, So just changing the mindset there takes a long time.
Yeah, really good point. I mean, if you're clear cutting in a forest area, you've got a lot of tops and branches on the forest floor. You've got to gather that, rake it, and in the past, fire it up and burn it off. In this kind of a forest setting, we never have that problem. As a matter of fact, we leave all of our tops and branches on the forest floor. But if you look around you here, there's no fuel loading on this forest floor. There's no fuel loading the way you would find in a clear cut or in a very young industrial forest. Nature, this is a fire-resistant ecosystem. It's also fire maintained, so fire is a part of this ecosystem. So we welcome it in here to do its job. And usually what we have in this kind of an ecosystem here at Wildwood are low intensity fires that take out the understory, but also replenish and rejuvenate that. And as you can see, there are no ladder fuels around you. As a matter of fact, you can have a look at these old guys and see that fire's only stretched probably about, maybe 5 or 10 meters up the bark of these trees. The bark is probably 6 to 8 to 12 inches thick. That fire will not run to the top of the crowns in these trees. And it'll actually rejuvenate the understory. So fire is just part of this ecosystem, and it works really well, but it does not work well in a managed forest. And the most vulnerable period of time for a managed forest is from when that forest is age 0 to about 35, 40 years old. When the stand stocking is extremely high, when that understory is close to the ground and can act as a ladder fuel up into more mature stands. So again, just one more look at the difference between industrial and ecoforestry.
Do you do any prescribed burns here?
We would love to do some, but the fire department has a problem with that. However, we did have one unprescribed burn. A power line came down and on a part of the one of the ridge lines, so it's an opportunity to have a look at how that small little area is regenning.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. So no, we'd love to have First Nations prescribed burn in here, but no, not allowed.
It's funny, the whole system across, I was going to say the province, but really, I guess, like the continent, kind of reminds me of like issues with like water rights on the Colorado River or something like that, where it's like water rights were established at like a high flow time when nobody thought it was going to be any lower. And then now that like climate change is affecting it, snowpack's different, rainfall's different, and there's suddenly like much lower yields where everybody's fighting for water rights. It's kind of the same thing with timber supply in a sense. Similar model where it's like we established annual allowable cuts at a time when it was all old growth. We could, making all these high economic returns. Then you have the fall down both economically and ecologically that no one's prepared to deal with because it's so drastic.
It's pretty dramatic. I mean, there has been a technological response to smaller timber, more challenged timber supplies, and that is just in the manufacturing process whereby you now have mass timber being promoted, you have glue lamps being promoted, you have finger joints being promoted, but that really has come to kind of the end of its cycle as well. So yeah, there's a challenge for fiber, and
even that stuff has its downsides because it's so glue and additive intensive. It increases the flammability of it. Still not as strong as healthy
not
old
as
growth
strong.
wood.
And the biggest challenge for forest lands that have never been a part of the timber harvest supply area or timber harvest land base is biofuel, because biofuel has now made it economic to go into areas that were not economic before in order to produce biofuel. So those small trees that were protected just because of their size and non-economic viability are now being turned into biofuels and exported. And that is a big challenge to areas, particularly in the north and northwest part of the province, that are relatively intact ecologically at the moment. I mean, we're talking about areas that are hundreds of thousands of hectares in size that are now being targeted as fiber supply areas.
And this is primarily for the British company Drax.
Yes, it is. Yes. Our old friends.
Just to throw them under the bus and put a name to it.
Yeah, thank you. And mounting I think an active campaign abroad to draw that to people's attention, because that is the worst of the worst in terms of CO2. And
because it's just, and the term biofuel is so misleading in that sense, because it makes it sound like it's some sort of like responsible fuel source. Mm-hmm. But basically in reality what they're doing is just liquidating whole ecologically intact forest ecosystems because they're there, and turning them into wood pellets, which are burned immediately. So it's not even going into like a long-lasting source product.
No, it's not as though you're harvesting a tree and then milling that into a lumber product that's going into a home for 50 years. This is going into the atmosphere right away. It's harvested this year, it's in the atmosphere next year. So the CO2 impact of that is fairly dramatic, and people don't understand that because there's been a pretty active PR campaign to look at that coming from quote-unquote renewable forests and as a renewable resource, and therefore it's green. So that's just not what's happening out there.
So talking a little bit about the effects and impacts of forestry that's happened over the past century. You just got back from a trip. You said you've been kind of going up north and looking at different communities and things that have dealt with fire and drought. Like, do you want to talk a little bit about your experiences and what you've seen, kind of like the repercussions of these impacts?
Yeah, well, for me, it's important to get on the land to really understand what we see reported quite consistently, and that is basically fires and floods and community impact from those two natural occurrences. So I've been out around the province in northern part of the island having a look at that, and it's pretty dramatic what I'm seeing. For the first time, I'm seeing major river systems, major watersheds, and I'm sure people are aware of this, like the Fraser, the Columbia, the Kootenay, the Similkameen, Kettle River, Okanagan system, all lower than I've ever seen them in the past. As a matter of fact, last time I went through the highway number 3 on the southern part of the province, the Similkameen River was actually muddy for the first time that I've ever traveled through that area and saw it. It was actually muddy. So you're looking at drought, you're looking at low water supplies, and that affects everything from forestry to agriculture to communities' ability to survive. But you're also looking at massive fires, and the fire regimes are. I would really encourage people to get out and have a look at the impact of fire, because these fires are big. They move fast. They are scary. There's little or nothing we can do about them. And they actually take up massive amounts of land. I think we're at something like 22,000 square kilometers of land we've lost to fires, and that's a massive amount of land. That's about 10 times the annual allowable cut in forestry terms for the province. That's huge. And when you look at the size of those fires, and look at the impacts on communities like Lytton, for example, Lillooet, Kelowna, the big fire there. there's a good and bad part of that. Number one, they're big fires and they're very scary. But the second part of that is that people develop out in those communities an awareness of how vulnerable they are, and that leads to an awareness of the impacts of climate change, and that leads to more of an appetite for change. Again, crisis produces change, so people are looking at what they need to do to not only adapt to it, but be sure that in forest management policy, those forests are being managed for fire, as well as hay and fiber stuff. So you've got that happening in the province. You've got real community challenges in terms of forest-based communities as well. I always peek into mill yards to see what the lumber supply is like, and have a look at what communities are actually milling up and where they're marketing that. And what I'm noticing in the interior is that some of those mill yards are looking pretty bare right now. I know the one in Midway, for example, is shut down, nothing in the yard there. Princeton, not much there. So a number of communities are having a fiber challenge, and that means their mills are not going to be producing timber. That's not employment for community members. So there's a real impact out there in terms of forestry. So you've got multiple impacts on these communities, and you've got a government that needs to respond to that, but not with more of the same, but with actually transition strategies. And that's what they talk about. Government is providing funding for those transition strategies, but it's shocking to get out there and look at the impact of fires and pests and depleted water systems, drought. But in terms of fires, it's also encouraging to look at areas that had fires, let's say 5-10 years ago, to have a look at what's regenerating in those areas, particularly in park areas that have been heavily hit by fires, and having a look at natural regeneration, looking at how nature actually recovers from that, because these are all fire-dependent ecosystems out there. Nature is doing a good recovery if we don't mess with it. So that when you're looking at post-fire operations, like do you harvest in these areas, you've also got to look at the ecological repercussions of harvesting in a fire area. What are you interfering with?
Successional-wise, you mean?
Yeah, in terms of, these are fire-dependent ecosystems, so they are depending on that biomass to be in the forest in order to recover properly. If you're taking a lot of that biomass out of there, then you are changing that ecosystem. And the same with bugs. Pine beetle is a good example. I mean, pine beetle swept through in ecologically intact forests like Manning Park, for example. The pine fell out. There were multiple other species like spruce that actually were there and just filled in the gaps. What most people don't realize about pine is a pioneer species in most areas of BC, and underneath that pine overstory is a spruce understory. And that's the one that, if the pine falls out, the spruce will actually regen from that. If you go in and harvest all that pine in a pine beetle kill area, you're probably wiping out the spruce understory as well. So you've set it back ecologically in time. Maybe just some considerations.
Yeah, I think like a lot of what you're talking about here, to me, it freaks me out seeing these things happening so quickly.
Yeah.
And you talk about like a transition period, and we all know how fast government moves. Even when it's moving fast, it's still decades long. But like you mentioned, like we're looking at like watershed regime change, where like rivers are going from like what was once like a nival system or glacial fed system. Like things are changing, so flow rates are changing throughout the year as like climate change affects, glacial melt affects rainfall throughout the season, which changes the way that the surrounding forests and watersheds like work with those. Like all these watersheds, like the species composition is based on the hydrological function of those watersheds. And then when you have mass land alterations like we've done over the past century, combined with fires that are not just stand regenerating fires, like they're fires that are in some regards like unnatural to a lot of these landscapes, like where we would have these low intensity fires coming through and thinning and helping create a healthy forest ecosystem. These high intensity fires, because of wide scale land alteration, is basically destroying whole forest ecosystems, regardless of their complexity or age, and like resetting it back to a point when like And then like that combined with the changing hydrological function, it's like, are we still going to have like Western red cedar forests coming up there? Like then we get into like the grounds of like people talking about assisted migration and planting sequoias and redwoods up here, which is like,
ouch.
yeah, I know. I feel the same way, but like people talk about that. I think it's like a little bit nihilistic to just like assume it's all that foregone. But then like I see things happening in real time. I see the lack of action happening from a government perspective sometimes, and it makes me just like, I worry about like the future state of these lands because things are changing so fast. So much of it is so complex and nuanced. And especially when it comes to like the political process, like so much of that is easily swept under the rug for quick fix marketing campaigns that are often led by industry-backed things. So it's like, how do we create change? Like, is change possible? I'm looking to you for some optimism, Barry.
Yeah. Is change? Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think what you're talking about are big disturbances that are occurring on the landscape right now. And part of big disturbances is that you have a climate change overlay, which means that even lands that would recover in the past are going to recover differently.
Right.
Now with climate change, a bump up in temperature, a difference in water regimes means that these ecosystems are going to look very, very different when they recover. Optimistic, yeah, you have to be optimistic in order to survive. If you've got an awareness of the massive disturbances that are occurring, the only thing you can fight that with is optimism. And you have to look for change where you find it. There's a lot of change on a smaller scale occurring. I think there is a change in people's attitudes. Number one, people are aware of what climate change is and what these disturbances are and the impact it will have on them. That transfers to a change in political will, because if politicians determine that climate change is an issue for people, and if they're seeing these big disturbances on the landscape, then there's more of a likelihood that they will implement policy that actually addresses that issue. And some of the policy initiatives are very, very good and well thought out. It's the operationalizing these policies that's the problem. Taking them from the drawing board and putting them into practice is a major challenge. Is it happening? Yeah, it's happening here at Wildwood. It's happening with Indigenous conservation areas. It's happening on small community forests, like Hair Proctor, for example, which is very, very clear that they are managing for ecological outcomes and not for fiber supply. Now, that was a first in the province. They managed to actually get that through the AAC barrier way back about 10, 15 years ago. That's really critical.
What one is that? That's Hair Proctor? That's up by
Hair Proctor,
Nelson,
by Nelson.
Right?
Yeah. So there are small scale examples of that change. The Guardian program with First Nations, really critically important. That's happening on the sort of terrestrial and aquatic landscape. Small communities and larger communities. I know Prince George, when they were beginning to look at a challenged fiber supply and beginning to go back and look at how do we manage our lands differently, they did not call in the industry experts to talk about that. What they did was went to the states, to the Forest Service people down there, and said, can you come up and talk to us about ecologically managed forest lands, because that's what you've been doing since the late 90s. So that kind of a change in attitude is what you want to see. We're on a tight timeline, and the timelines are 2025, 2030, and beyond that, but they're very, very tight right now. As you know, if we don't make some major changes by 2030, then we're reaching tipping points, and tipping points are points where you cannot recover, and you're looking at then a technological solution to climate change, which is very, very dangerous and very expensive. So you got to do some things right up front. The thing that will get in the way of change is the next election. If people take a backward step like they did in the early 2000s and elect a government that is not climate friendly and does not understand climate change, then we're lost, quite frankly. So, yeah, I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic that this, and I'll bring it full circle to Wildwood, that what we're doing at Wildwood, the forest management planning we do here, ecological forest management, ecoforestry, is the solution to the problem that we need to scale up. This has to be done at a watershed level, at a landscape level. Landscape level planning is now occurring on the part of the province, Ministry of Forests, but we need to be included in that conversation so that people understand the system that we use and can come and have a look at Wildwood. Small but important, because here you have a longitudinal look at what ecoforestry, ecological management looks like and what your forest can look like in the future.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit more about implementing that stuff.
Yeah.
Because that's some good optimism to kind of
Sure.
talk about. So you mentioned that part of the property extends that way, where you have some controls where you're able to look at like what this forest would look like in a healthy, mature state, which helps replicate how things are managed over here. How do you balance that? How do you what's the process like for selecting a tree here? Where does it go? How does it get milled? Where does that wood end up?
Yeah, well, we have kind of a number of steps we go through. Number one is we have a look around and look at, we're working with nature and we're looking at natural process and we're looking at natural disturbance types. So in this forest, natural disturbance types are wind throw, bugs, fungi, fire. And when we're looking at harvesting trees in this forest, we're looking at next in line of mortality, which trees are not very, very healthy, which ones are next to probably die off. And that's our first choice. We're also looking at light on the forest floor. If we're looking at an area like this that has a lot of trees that are young, a little bit repressed, then we may be looking at taking out one of these bigger trees to allow more light in and allow that to sort of take off and become our next old growth candidates. And once we've run through those two, we've probably reached our AAC. We don't need to really go beyond that.
How about wind throw?
Wind throw, the consideration for wind throw is whether or not we leave it as large woody debris on the forest floor, which we often do, or whether we take it out and mill it up. Now, when we do harvest trees or we do pull them out of the forest, we make sure we maximize our fiber gain by putting them through a sawmill. So we run a small portable sawmill here on the property, and although it's a small scale operation, what we're interested in doing is demonstrating on this property small scale forest management, because in the Douglas fir zone, most of the intact forests that are left are under 100 hectares in size, so they're small scale, and we want to be able to demonstrate how to effectively manage that. So that's what we do here at Wildwood. When we're looking at our ambitions for the future, we want to scale up, and what we want to scale up to are woodlot size forests, because that's a natural starting point for communities. There are a lot of woodlots, which are crown tenures around communities that need to be ecologically managed. Currently, they're not. We're also looking at trying to influence community forests into ecological management plans. Again, you'd think the community would have the most interest in managing their forests ecologically, particularly for water regulation. And so that's a good target audience for us. But what we'd really like to do is take an entire watershed and put that into an ecological management plan so we can begin to collect the data that we need around the difference between ecologically managed and industrial managed forest lands.
Right. And so looking around here, there's no like major roads to haul timber out like you would typically see in a logging operation.
No, and part of that is just forest disturbance, and
So how do you get the logs out?
well, we in this particular operation, what we're using are a logging arch, and that's a really old technology. I mean, back in the beginning of logging here in BC, they used to use logging arches. So what we're demonstrating is a logging arch, a tractor, and a winch. And in terms of small scale operations, it's important to be not disturbing much of your understory here, but also paying attention to economics. And that's the kind of equipment that any small operator can actually afford or probably has on the land already.
And a logging arch, to clarify, that's that thing where when you lift up on it, it pinches the log, and that's what you used to drag it out.
Yeah, imagine 2 tires and then a big
Yeah.
sort of arch in between them and a winch on it.
And that's what like horses used to tow back in the day.
Horses used to tow it back, and
You're just
when
using a 4x4.
we're using a tractor, and the advantage of that is that we can winch that log off the forest floor so that we only have the back end dragging. So logging arch has been all through the forest that we walk through today, and you wouldn't notice any kind of a disturbance.
Right. You're not building these big roads that are
building the big roads, and the problem with big roads is that you have an impact. When you build a road through a forest, you're impacting that forest about 100 meters on either side of that road. So you're changing that little ecosystem. But you're also interrupting and interfering with natural water drainage systems and putting them through culverts. Here, we don't want to interrupt that at all with the road if we can help it. So we have longer hauls in terms of going deeper into our forest areas and bringing out logs from a longer distance, which is not as economic as a clear cut, but that's just the price you pay. That's the extra little bit you put. It's the trade-off. Yeah, thanks.
Well, I mean, it's like the clear cut, and the thing that makes clear cuts profitable is because you're not taking into account all the externalities, all the hidden costs that you end up occurring ecologically. So if you have to make it a little bit more difficult to harvest that wood but keep those ecological costs low, it's a trade-off,
Yeah, it's a trade-off. I mean, look at a feller buncher in a clear cut, and
exactly.
You're paying a feller buncher, you're paying that contractor by the cubic meter, so he's taking up as much wood fiber as he can, whether it's small or big. Doesn't matter to him, and then you're balancing the economics between big and small logs. And mills are really efficient at sorting these logs and getting the best economic return from them, but that's what you're finding in the clear cut. And then you're replanting and going through the rotation one more time. Here, we're able to select maybe larger timber for what we're pulling out. It's not very often we're bringing out small trees at all, so we're getting a better economic return. We're also bringing out some fairly good wood in terms of end use. So that tree behind us, for example, you look up that's clear pretty well to the top. So we're looking at that's got some really nice tight rings on it. So when we're milling that particular tree, we're looking at what's the best use for that. Well, that's a flooring tree, for example. A lot of good flooring comes out of that, and we're getting a fair amount, a good return per square foot on that particular tree. So
how does keeping the milling on site or being done, I guess, by within the operation, how does that help reduce costs, or I guess like provide more opportunity for Wildwood versus sending it to like another mill somewhere?
Oh yeah. Well, first of all, you're not transporting off the property, so you're limiting your carbon footprint a little bit. Milling on the property means that you're actually able to take the mill slabs and you're able to use every part of that log, from the mill slabs on the outside to everything you're producing from the inside. But if you're a lumber grader like I am, certified lumber grader, then you can actually maximize the cut and the pieces you're taking off that log. You've got a cant in the middle. You've probably got, as I mentioned, that tree there might be for flooring. Another tree might be for cants, timber frame. Another tree might be just 2x6, 2x8 kind of a thing. So you're able to maximize your cut gains from that.
So it's like maximizing higher quality pieces of wood instead of just producing
higher quality pieces of wood, but you're also marketing that wood. So what you're marketing is not only a piece of wood, but you're marketing a Wildwood story. You're branding.
Right.
Yeah. There you go. You a piece of wood like this, and let's say you live edge a piece of wood in someone's living room. Suddenly, you produce the conversation piece for them, a story for them. They feel good about that. If you could build a timber frame house out of Wildwood wood, you'd feel good about that. You knew where it came from. You knew the energy coming into your home was good energy. It didn't come from a clear cut. It actually came from an ecologically managed forest. So that's the branding that goes with that. And it's the kind of branding that other woodlot operations do in order to market their product. And it's good branding. And
so for sure, I get that, and I back it, and I understand like that's kind of what makes an operation this small scale like profitable when you're competing against an industry that is so heavily subsidized and marketed on economic efficiency. That's kind of what you have to do to exist. I think like scaling this up though, like this is a model where you and the people who manage this are so intimately connected to the lands. You know the forest, you know the trees. You're like looking out for like things that like in ecological succession. It's like very much a very interconnected relationship with the lands versus the kind of model that we see where it's like, again, timber cruisers just look for quality of wood, and then like that's calculated into the cost of the tenure, and then like how all that like operates. It's very, very broad sweeping, and you don't have that connection. Scaling this model up, how do you see, or like what sort of hurdles do you see in getting people to build that relationship with the land and take into account all these different methods of practice in a way that like makes it a more fair market, so people don't have to like feel guilty for buying something at Home Depot, for example, like knowing that wood probably came from a clear cut, even if it's FSC or SFI certified. SFI certified probably more so is from a clear cut.
Ouch.
We don't need to get into that.
Yeah.
But it's like how do we create it so it's like we can just get better wood everywhere, so you're not having to pay a premium for this like high quality kind of boutique wood, like how do we shift the industry so that we can get more hands-on management, more local connections, build some of that like high quality wood value into just general operations?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question because economically, obviously, it's more expensive to produce wood from an ecological model than it is from the model in industrial forestry. That's a big advantage they have. And I'll just comment a little bit about that because industrial forestry, basically here in BC, most of that product goes on to the international market. So those guys that are operating in forest tenure here are competing with that international market out there, which does not have many ecological constraints. So the shift to an ecological model here in BC puts us at a huge disadvantage in terms of marketing this wood abroad. So I think that what's going to happen is your forest industry collapses a little bit. The forest companies that are currently here in BC, actually, some of them, or maybe most of them, disappear. And then you're back to the whole idea of community forestry. And community forestry basically addresses a local demand for a wood product, or a province-wide demand, or a countrywide demand for forest product, and that's a limited demand, so you're cutting down on the industrial part of what you're doing to begin with. I think you can model it. I think that if people want the advantage of ecological services, if they want to pay attention to flooding and forests and stuff like that, the price they pay is keeping their forest base intact, and in order to do that, they're going to have to pay a little bit more for a local wood product. And I know that's tough for some people to digest, but you can't have your cake and eat it too. You have to make some tough decisions on that. If you allow this to scale up, then we can put better economics into it. We can't do that at Wildwood because we're too small. But give us a watershed or give us a landscape that we can work with, and we'll show you how to do that. And then we'll move into full cost accounting, because that's what we're talking about here. What's the full cost of clear cutting versus the full cost of ecologically based forestry? And hands down, worth more standing. And that's a constant theme right now, and people have proven that out, because these trees and these ecosystems are worth more intact than they are bringing them to market and exporting wood products.
Well, I would challenge that cost thing just a little bit, in that you say that people will have to pay a higher price for their wood, and maybe that's true at the consumer level, but people are already paying that higher price. Like the timber industry in BC alone is subsidized $365 million, I believe, a year annually for those clear-cut operations, and a majority of which is going overseas to overseas markets, and all that profit is privatized and goes directly to the people who own the companies. That's taxpayer dollars, the public good, that is being privatized by the people who own those companies. And then bigger than that, socially, we're all incurring the ecological costs of those operations, to which we're not seeing any demand. So it's like, yeah, we might be paying more as a consumer to like get like a better 2x4, but in doing that, we're supporting our communities. We're not supporting overseas profits. And again, like the big five here in British Columbia, you know, you look at West Fraser, Canfor, like these are publicly owned companies that are slowly pulling out of the Canadian market and going down south to like Georgia, opening mills down where it's like cheaper to mill wood. Like they're not at all concerned with the state that they leave these lands or the communities that are operating up here. Like, so if we're able to break up those big kind of like monopolies and have more smaller community forests, like have more control on the ground, like it makes sense for our communities.
Yeah, I think it does. I think that you're going to find the large forest industry is actually disappearing. I mean, it's the economics are much better in Georgia, but they're much better in a country like New Zealand as well. We have a hard time competing with that, so there's a natural sort of cycle we're going through, and I would take that government support in a heartbeat if you give it to me or give it to our organization so that we can go in and set up an ecological management system on a larger land base and just see how that's going to play out. And then we'll have a look at the economics of that. But you have to be realistic about the economics as well. Small operations like this don't make you money. Larger operations can, and they can serve as a dual need. And that's where my sort of energy would go at this point in time, is to scale this up. And let's have a look at the economics and let's do full cost accounting on it. And at the end of the day, this is going to be much more lucrative.
So where can people go to, like, what can the average person do to support this transition?
That's a really good question. The average person, first of all, has to look at their own families, quite frankly. And what motivates me to do the work that I do is looking at children, looking at grandchildren, looking at families, looking at communities. And what I see is parents and grandparents as a passion for their kids and grandkids. And they're concerned about them, and they're concerned about their future. And the starting point, just rearranging your value system so you can say, you know, it's really important that I do something about the future for my kids and grandkids. How do I do that? How do I get involved in that? Do I support organizations like AIS? Do I pressure my politician? Do I talk about this to community members and friends? But you have to get that attitude in place first. And then you can begin to construct change, and be aware of the forces that want status quo, and be aware that they're very, very good at PR and at counteracting change. But at the end of the day, you know, when you look at the future for kids, it doesn't look very bright right at the moment. And in a very limited time span, we can actually take the action required to change that. And push your politicians, push for legislative change, push for accountability and transparency, because that's important. But also be aware of what they are doing in the process and whether or not that's been effective. Listen to your organizations that are out there doing the work for you. There are a lot of environmental organizations that are doing really good work. They're your advocates at this point in time. Support them. If you don't have the time, they do. Make them your voice, and a voice to be heard. You can do that, and then you can actually demand or look at effective forest change. Push the agenda on this change that we're looking at right now, and particularly in forest-dependent communities. If you're a member of that community, push for the long-term picture in terms of viability of your industry. And if you do that, then you want to make the switch. That kind of answer part of that?
No, I think...
What did I miss, Ross?
I think that's...
pitch in here.
I think that's great. I was going to ask about showing up and taking a stand. You went out to Fairy Creek, didn't you?
Oh, I was out at Fairy Creek as an individual, not representing EIS, but as an individual, you know, many times. You know, again, you go out into those forests out in that area, the Port Renfrew area, or go up to Strathcona Park, anywhere like that, and you're overwhelmed, actually overwhelmed by the beauty and by the they're stunning, they're magnificent, and you feel that and you say, my God, it's like finger painting over the Mona Lisa. It's like you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't take these forests down. You wouldn't cut these forests. So got a bunch of young people out there and elders like myself making a stand and saying this is just not right. We'll try and interrupt this process while the government gets its act together and gets going on it. But yeah, you got to take a stand.
I think that's a good transition to kind of start to wrap things up here. I mentioned to you at the beginning that for every episode, I do a donation through Patreon supporters to a nonprofit of my guest choice. Who would you like to support with this donation? And what kind of things can people do to support? Like, what kind of local nonprofits are you supporting?
Oh, yeah, plenty of local nonprofits. I mean, the guys that are doing a good bit of work are Sierra Club, of course. And that's good work in terms of advocacy, but it also gives good scientific backdrop information. So they're great guys. The Ancient Forest Alliance, the whole repertoire of forest ethics. I mean, you name them. There's a dozen of them out there. I would say Stand Earth. We've had the Stand Earth people up here. They've actually done volunteer work at Wildwood. And again, what we're looking for are supporting younger people in this transition period. Get them involved, support them in their climate change advocacy roles. And I can't think of an organization that does more for that particular group than Stand Earth.
Is that who you'd like your donation to go to? Awesome. I thought you were for sure going to say just put it back into Wildwood. EIS.
I would like to say that, but that might be self-serving. So let's get it out of here. And if people want to donate, exposure through you will encourage people to donate to Wildwood. So
and where can people go to learn more about Wildwood and the Ecoforestry Institute?
Yeah, they can go directly onto our website. Just punch in Ecoforestry and you'll come to Ecoforestry Institute and Wildwood.
Oh, and it's all the same.
It's all the same.
Okay. I have one more final kind of question for you. It's kind of a nerdy one, but I was hoping you could talk about it. We've got this stump here. This is like a living stump, and that one over there.
Yep.
Do you want to talk a little bit about these stumps and why they're so important and kind of indicative of a healthy ecosystem?
Yeah, and indicative of community because what we're talking about is Suzanne Simard and, of course, the work that she's done with fungi. So we have a mother tree here, and Ross is busy looking at that mother tree, and beside the mother tree is a stump. But the mother tree, through these fungi networks, has actually been supporting the smaller, younger trees around it, but it also supports an injured tree. So that injured tree, that stump, has been supported by that mother tree over time until it finally reached a point where it was not useful to provide support for that anymore. So that's what's happening there. It keeps it alive. It keeps it well. It gives it a little shot of what it needs, and that's a community where this mother tree is also supporting these smaller trees. Look at those three around it, Ross. I mean, there's a transfer of carbon to those trees as well. And what Suzanne would say is that these mother trees can actually recognize their offspring and give them a little extra shot, just to give them a little bit of an edge over the rest of their competitive crew here.
Has Suzanne been out here?
Yeah, she has been. In early days, she was out here, and she has an open invitation to come back because, of course, Nancy Turner are internationally famous. Ethnobotanist knows Suzanne fairly well, so yeah.
Amazing. Any parting words that you would like to leave people with? I feel like you've dropped quite a bit of wisdom here, but anything else that comes to mind?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of information out there, so I think that go out there and come to Wildwood. We'll show you around. First and foremost, come here. We'll give you a tour. We'll show you the importance of that. But I would say
rent
to people,
the cabin on a holiday weekend.
Yeah,
get the family out.
Yeah, get the family out. Get out. Have a look at forests. And if you can find an old growth forest or a park somewhere that's natural regen, go and have a look at it. Be overawed by it. Get attached to it. And then think about how you can protect it and how other lands need to be protected and well. So the advice is get out on the land. Start developing that relationship. Take your kids out. Your kids will take you, because kids often know more than we do about what's going on out here. So get out there.
Yeah. I love that idea of forming like an emotional relationship with it. You
form that relationship, but also when you're out in this kind of a forest, recognize this as a family. much the same as your family. It's structured in a very, very similar way. It's alive. There are family members here. These family members are communicating with each other. They're feeding each other. They're cooperating together. They're competing at times. But this is a family and a community, and it has to be seen that way. Yeah, pretty important.
I love taking that as like a little excerpt of society in a sense. Like it depends on diversity. Like there's diversity. There's like people working together, things working together so that everything here can survive and thrive.
Yeah, develop that relationship. Your family, this family here. Where do you fit into this? How does that fit with your family? And realize that these things are critically important to you. Again, for all the services they supply. But take a deep breath of air. That's providing the oxygen you breathe, and just give some appreciation for that. It's an incredible process when you think about it.
I remember a few years ago, I interviewed you for a documentary film I was trying to make. I came out here and did that. Never ended up getting funding for that. If there are any film producers out there that want to fund a really amazing documentary on this, hit me up. We can continue that. But one of the things that we talked about was that kind of like spiritual, emotional relationship to forests. And you've definitely like retouched on that today. I remember like at that time sharing it with like a friend of mine in Squamish. Who's like she's a counselor as well, so she's like very intuitive and like emotionally connected, and her like being like, oh yeah, that's funny you mentioned that, because I was in a forest the other day that like just felt really dark and evil and spooky, and I was like, oh, where was this forest? And she's like, oh, right here. I'm like, that's a like classic second growth forest stand. And it's true, because like you do get an emotional response from any forest you go into. It's just a difference between like I don't know. I'm a child of the 90s, so I'll say, you know, like the kind of Fern Gully, lush, like rich environment where you could see fairies running around and everything's healthy and vibrant, kind of Avatar style, versus something like a grim fairy tale where it's like witches and dark. There's nothing growing. It's like, you know, everything's dark thin and bony. So there's like this difference between like a healthy forest.
Yeah, one forest you walk into Wildwood, and you feel cocooned. You feel like it's taking care of you. You know, you feel safe in this forest, that there's a lot to see and do. But the overall part of that is this forest is taking care of me. I'm in good hands. And that's my relationship. I need to take good care of this forest. So, yeah, and some forests are just plain spooky. But yeah.
Awesome. Well, that's a great place to wrap it up. Thanks so much for taking the time, Barry. Really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for coming out, Ross. Last we got together. So, and I encourage the idea of a documentary, because a documentary means you can travel around the province and actually have a look at the big impacts about forest management, about different systems of forest management, and about communities and community response. So, yeah, getting funding for that kind of a thing would be just awesome.
Yeah, again.
Yeah.
If anybody's out there that wants to fund a really cool documentary film, I would still love to do it.
Okay. Right. Thanks, Ross.
Yeah, thanks, Barry.
Yeah.
Wildwood is just such an incredible, amazing little spot out there. It's so inspiring to see our possible future here active in the present. I mean, think about how great it would be to have that methodology implemented all over the continent and the world. I'd encourage you all to try to get some time to check out Wildwood if you're ever in the area. I'm pretty sure they run free tours weekly through the summer, so you can learn more about them at ecoforestry.ca, and I'll throw a link to that in the show notes here. So, for every podcast episode, I make a donation to a nonprofit or cause of my guest's choice, and this week, Barry chose to give his donation to Stand Earth, who do some really amazing activism work to protect ecosystems around the Cascadian bioregion and beyond. You can learn more about them at stand.earth. Huge thanks to all of you who support this project on Patreon, because without you, these donations wouldn't be possible, in addition to this entire podcast you're listening to right now. And if you're enjoying this podcast and all the fun educational videos I make all over social media, you can help support their production by becoming a Patreon supporter for as little as $1 a month or more at patreon.com/nerdyaboutnature, or by making a one-time donation and getting some pretty sweet Nerdy About Nature merch at nerdyaboutnature.com. All of the support goes into giving us the stability to continue putting time, energy, resources, and research into all these various topics to continue making content that aims to educate, inspire, and shape a new future for tomorrow. So if you're enjoying it, then we'd really appreciate your support that we can keep on doing it. Either way, stoked you're all here, engaging and learning. So thanks so much for tuning into this episode, and stay tuned for more coming soon. Cheers. This episode of the Nerdy About Nature Podchat series was produced by me, Ross Reed, and made possible with support from individuals like yourself. For ways to support this project and to learn more, check out nerdaboutnature.com or @nerdaboutnature on your favorite social platform.